Hello again, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. First of all, an announcement. Next week will be Easter Sunday, and we will not have this Sunday school class next Sunday. Forego that period. However, the virtual option, there's on archives of all of the lessons we've done virtually, so any of those are available for you to go back to. But if you do, I would urge you to go back and review those first two lessons on Paul as a good introductory session to Corinthians. Today's class, we continue in our study of 1 Corinthians, and today's is lesson number 10, and it focuses on chapter 6. Paul here addresses two issues. And so you'll probably see it divided that way in your particular Bible. Excuse me. Those two issues that he addressed is, first of all, lawsuits among the believers or among the church members. And the other one is a continuation of more on the sexual ethics in the church that he started, in lesson number 5. Which he is not done with, by the way. We'll forego the reading of 1 Corinthians today, chapter 6. It's pretty straightforward as far as the read. The question, I want to spend my time primarily placing this in context of the time and place, because we need to understand two big issues, scholars tell us. Number one, our ethics today, although quite diverse compared to the ethics in America, for example, and in Kentucky 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago. So we have that issue that we have to kind of keep in mind in context. Secondly, we've got to make sure we understand that there is a major difference in the ethical standards and social mores relative to Paul, a Jew in background and education, versus the Corinthians, who are basically Polynesian Greek. It's the core, and lots of immigrants in there, and of course they're now under the rule of Rome. It's a very different set of backgrounds, and consequently that's what we're going to be dealing with. To understand this, scholars tell us we should assume that Paul does not, although Paul does not specifically say so, that some of the Corinthian believers are taking other members to civil court. That is, other members of the church over disagreements, and they're taking them to court. We surmise that based on what he's saying. Furthermore, the Corinthian church, it appears, did not see any kind of problem with this. Furthermore, they didn't ask for Paul's advice in this area either. But Paul sees this as trouble. It bothers him. And so he's going to give his advice on it. We have to understand that in the traditional Greco-Roman culture of the time in this area of Greece, the traditional way of settling disputes was through the law, the civil laws, if you could afford it. It was extremely expensive, and it was quite a diverse set of steps, scholars tell us. And so you'll see some scholars, they tend to spend all the time on that cost and all that sort of thing, that it's not fair, but that's probably not the value system that's involved here. Paul clearly here gives them his advice on this, and not only advice, he tends to shame them relative to this, but they're using the court system. Again, as before, when we place this in context, what we are dealing with is a conflict between Paul's value system, rooted in the Jewish community from which he was raised, and which he's still a member, versus the Corinthian system, culture, rooted in the Hellenistic system of thinking and culture with modification by Rome now that Rome has ruled for about 100 years. And that's the setting in 1st century AD when Paul is addressing these problems. We need to appreciate that the Jewish law of Paul's time forbade going to pagan courts, that is, civil courts, against another Jew in your synagogue, especially in your synagogue. But I think, depending on how you read some of this, probably any believing Jew. It was considered to be actually blasphemous against God's laws to go to before a pagan judge and have a conflict ruled on if it was between two Jews. Instead, they had their own synagogue courts, courts of elders, they were often called, who ruled on cases. And most of the time, if you'll remember, when we were studying the Apocrypha material, the foreign countries that ruled them allowed them to keep that system in place because it worked pretty well for them. So within the Jewish system of Paul's background, the courts were within the synagogue, within the temple, depending on where you were at. The Jews despised the Roman court system, Greek court systems that were in place at Paul's time. It's pretty clear from various writings at that time that they despised them. And it's from some of those where this financial aspect gets brought into some of the arguments. In addition, we should recognize that Paul's position here is also driven by his eschatological vision and conviction that we touched on last time. And that is his belief that God will be the final judge of sin in another age to come. And of course, Paul thinks that's right around the corner. And the believers will make up the court in heaven, so to speak. This is outlined in Daniel chapter 7, and we saw mention of it, references to it, similar ideas in several of the books of the Apocryphal material that we studied this past year. Unfortunately, however, Paul at no place in his writings that have survived gives us a full disclosure of his eschatological vision. Instead, he points towards it in places, occasionally hints at different things, scattered points throughout his writings. And based on those, it's pretty clear that he must have told the church, each of these churches that he formed. And so he's explained this view to the Corinthians because he's expecting them to know his and appreciate his stand on this and to accept it and believe in it as he does. Recall from chapter 5 that Paul had argued that the believer, that is what we would today call Christians, within the church were qualified to judge issues within the church community. He made a big point of that in chapter 5. So his timing is good here to follow up with this in chapter 6 to advance this bigger issue that the lawsuits that they are accustomed to having against one another should not be happening. It is not germane in the new system. Recall and note in your recalling that he in no way did Paul support the idea that the church should be judging the outside community. That's very clear in Paul's writings in multiple places. It's you judge within the church community. You clean up. The old synagogue rule was, Jewish teaching, if you will, is you clean up your synagogue community and let it serve as an example to the world of how things should be. That's this concept that Paul is going to be writing on throughout this. Paul reminds them that they have already lost if they go to court against a member in the church. That is, if they file a formal suit, so to speak. Rather, he argues, why not accept a better position? Why not accept that you're wronged, that you're defrauded, whatever, by this person, and suffer whatever consequence it is? Because regardless, if you go to court, that is an outside court, and even if you win, there's still two losers: the other party and the church. And so Paul sees this as, in either case, at least two people have lost, and he would even argue that the third party, the one who thinks he wins, has lost because he has discredited his church community. He's not showing a sign of love. He doesn't tell us all that. This is pretty clear when you pull all of Paul's writings together, though, that that's the mindset he operates under, and it clearly was the mindset that the Jewish community operated under. Let God judge the wrongdoer, is Paul's position. He says that here. As such people will not inherit the kingdom of God. Paul then moves into expanding his list of vices, but scholars remind us that in no way is that to be an inclusive list. It's just examples. In fact, many scholars would say these are probably examples. There are things that are actually going on in that Corinthian church community at the time he's writing, and he's aware of, based on reports that he's received. Plus, he was there for a while. And some of those, he's pretty sure, are still going on. Most people, most scholars would say. They are living as if they still are fully active members of the Corinthian social and the Corinthian culture, rather than pulling themselves out of that culture. Many of the behaviors mentioned here were acceptable behaviors in that culture, although they may be appalling to us today with our mores. We've got to understand that those people had a very different culture, especially at that period of time. You cannot look at that culture today and see that, because that culture has had 2,000 years of the Greek Orthodox Christianity, which is its major influence now. So we're talking about the culture at Paul's time. Paul is saying, this is not acceptable, what you're doing. These activities that he mentions are not acceptable in God's culture, in God's kingdom here on earth. But in verse 11, he makes a key point that you should pick up on. You were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of God, or words to that effect depending on the translation you read. The verbs here in the Greek are all passive, scholars point out. These were all God's acts of salvation, or in that act of salvation. To you is the idea. As thus the basis of why you need to follow God's rules of morality in your life is the idea that he's trying to get over here. This is what God did for you. He washed you, he justified you, he sanctified you. And therefore, you should follow his rules, not the rules of your older society. Of course, to Paul, these rules that they're following the rules of God are the rules of the Old Testament. They are the culture. They are the mores that he was raised with. They are, to him, they were the law. And he knows that is where he's coming from. He grew up with that as his paradigm. So Paul isn't making a paradigm shift here. This is his paradigm. Okay? But the Corinthians have not yet accepted that as the paradigm. God has placed you among the holy people, Paul says. And so he's implying, understand that. And what does he mean by that? He means, for the Jewish concept, meaning you're now an Israelite. Wake up and live like you're an Israelite. This is his whole thing he outlines in Romans, as well as he's touched on it here several times. Live like it, not like a Greek, Roman pagan. I'm putting words in his mouth, but I think that's the idea. So he is back to the basics here and making the point that being a believer, what we would say is a Christian, is more than just a new label. You must come out of the Corinthian culture, the social mores that you grew up with, that you consider acceptable, they're no longer acceptable. You're now full members of God's family and living under a new master, under a new Lord. And it's that Lord and Master's rules that you are to follow, not some kind of a hybrid that you create between his rules and your old rules. That's the concept that Paul's laying out here. We need to appreciate here that except for the Jewish community, the world into which Christianity was born, and it's being born at this time with Paul, there was little connection between religious faith and sexual ethics or sexual mores. In general, for this area, several scholars point out that in reviewing verses 12 through 20, that second half of this reading today, that sex prior to and outside of marriage was generally accepted as a norm for the male, not for the female, but for the male. And that it was not considered, what they were doing was not considered in any form or fashion a religious or moral issue. Very different in the Jewish community and those faiths that evolved from it, Christianity and Islam. That was clearly the case in the Corinthian, social historians tell us, in the Corinthian region. So Paul's attitude here, Paul's writings here, is he's encountering that culture in the church, and they're having difficulty leaving some of their normal behaviors. Paul is not being judgmental of their secular community or the outside world in general. But that's an issue that Christians today don't seem to pick up on, by the way. But Paul here makes it very clear these are for operating in the church. Instead, he is making his statement based on what is expected as correct moral behavior for those within the church community, which is still within Judaism at this time. His time especially, although it is evolving towards a new faith, so to speak. Hasn't reached that point yet. I am free to do anything, Paul says. In other words, as a Christian, as a believer, I'm free under my understanding of the new salvation, the new covenant. I am free to do whatever I want. It's Paul's idea here. Freedom associated with the Christian faith, as we would say, apart from Judaism. Yes, he is free of the law's obligations, but get this point. It's understood here that Paul is implying, but I'm not free as a Christian of the wisdom that comes from following those rules in Judaism, in Christianity, in the believing system. I think that's the precedence that he is setting here. There's wisdom in doing it the Jewish way. Bottom line, since God's Spirit dwells in your body, and that body is God's temple, so keep that temple holy. Moreover, you were bought and paid for. As a Christian, as a believer, you're bought and paid for by the price of Christ's death on the cross. That's a very timely thing as we approach Easter, or we can reflect on that. Paul's idea here, you are bought and paid for. So yes, and you were bought and paid for by that cross, the actions of that cross. So yes, you have been freed of the law, but you still serve a master, Christ and God. And their idea of the rules are those that are outlined in the Old Testament, is essentially what Paul is teaching here. Your life is to be God-centered, not self-centered. The Lord rules. It's the Lord's rules, not your rules, not your mores, Corinthians, but God's mores. The rest of Paul's letter will, in many ways, the rest of this letter of 1 Corinthians, will focus on this basic idea that you are glorified by God, your body is glorified, and to be glorified to God. How do you do it? He will use examples and talk about that. You are to be a steward of it and a slave to that mission. And as you do, you must learn to live with members within your Christian community, that is, within the community of believers here. Not as a self-centered, my world comes first type church. It's God's rules, is what he's implying. As we close, again, a reminder, we will not have this class Easter Sunday. We'll skip that so that you have more time for the special day, and then we'll return the week after that. So I hope you have a good study, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.